All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of Cryptosophy. This week, we're going to be discussing Jordan Peterson. He's a thinker that has had a profound effect on myself. And I think, Max, it's probably fair to say the same of you. Perhaps not as much as me, but we both have engaged him for a number of, months, a year for me, a little longer than a year for me, actually. And I can just say that the effect that he has had on my moral life has been absolutely substantial. And I'm really excited to kind of engage his thoughts in dialogue with you, Max, and see if we can tease out some hidden wisdom from the great father of YouTube.
Yeah, of course. I actually began listening to Jordan Peterson on Sam Harris's Waking Up podcast. And I took Sam's side a little bit too tribalistically, I think, at first in that debate. And that debate is really interesting. It's 2 parts and 2 podcasts, but
it is. Well, before we get into all of this, because this is going to be really interesting fodder for conversation.
I just wanted to say real quick. So since then, I've been doubting that. And recently, it's had a moral impact on my life, but it's a bit soon to tell exactly what that means.
Awesome. So just as a few housekeeping items before we get going. So we are in the midst of reading Aristotle's Metaphysics, which is proving to be, very difficult. And let's just be humble about it. It's kind of, we're overreaching our intellectual capabilities with this text. And we are going to power through it, and we'll be delivering a podcast on it in either next week or the week after. In the meantime, between this podcast and that one, there will be another sort of free-form podcast like this one where Max and I are simply discussing something pertinent to current events or philosophy or all of those things. And we think probably the format for the Aristotle's Metaphysics podcast will be a bit different, precisely because it's so difficult. I think that what we will likely do is use it as a sort of framework for which to have a discussion that builds upon it, rather than attempt to kind of dive deeply into the text, because I just know that I'm not quite there yet. But upcoming in the schedule in a couple months, we'll be reading Thomas Aquinas' commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics. So hopefully that will give us the ability to have a renewed conversation about the metaphysics itself.
Yes, it is. It's almost torture to read, and that's not because it's necessarily boring. It's just the most challenging book I've ever read.
Indeed.
Yeah, but after Aristotle, there's the Aeneid.
So we're hitting Lucretius first.
Lucretius, yeah.
Yeah, so De Rerum Natura, that's going to be... We've got a couple of really excellent books coming up after the Metaphysics that I think will be really engaging, because it's sort of a little bit of a return to mythology. Lucretius, not so much, but it's poetry. So we'll at least be back in a little bit more of my wheelhouse in terms of things that I've both read before and have studied a little bit. So it'll be great to reread those and have those kinds of conversations with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to those texts if we can only climb this mountain first.
We'll get through it. Okay, so let's talk about Jordan Peterson. I thought perhaps a really good place to start. You kind of mentioned that you first encountered Jordan Peterson on the Waking Up podcast by Sam Harris. I encountered Jordan Peterson a little bit earlier, and I'd like to detail that story sort of as an introduction to why we're having this conversation. I think it's really important that we kind of set the framework, because in my opinion, Jordan Peterson is one of the most important thinkers of the 21st century. And I know it's a bit early to make a claim like that, but he's certainly had a profound impact upon millions of individuals, myself included, and has made a demonstrable and verifiable impact upon the quality of their lives, including my own. So I'm excited to kind of share my own story of the last year or so, kind of tied in with Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. So I first encountered Jordan Peterson as a senior in college. So this was, I think, February of 2017. I think that that's right. And, I was really into Milo Yiannopoulos for a while. I was just, gosh, it wasn't really that I agreed with Milo on, nearly anything. It was that I was really just inspired that somebody was speaking up against the bullshit of the regressive left, um, and I respected the fact that Milo was willing to be a contradiction. That's a quality I think is, somewhat true of myself. I tend to attempt to hold contradictory opinions in tension with one another, and kind of through that conflict, I emerge as, having a different perspective on, perhaps the mainstream narrative of certain things. So I really appreciated, Milo for at least introducing me to what we'll call the free speech movement, which became or has become the intellectual dark web. I think, go ahead.
Did you see Milo as more profound in the beginning and then that sort of fell out?
Yes, I really did believe that Milo was really profound. And then through, YouTube's video after YouTube video after YouTube video, I went from Milo to Ben Shapiro and ultimately to Jordan Peterson. But it was interesting. I think there are two faces of Milo that are very different from one another. There's the very humble, gracious Milo that comes out, particularly when he's asked about questions of faith and religion. There's a really, really, I don't even know what adjective to put on it, but there's this clip where somebody asks him more or less, how do you reconcile the fact that you're a practicing gay and a practicing Catholic? And gosh, he quotes Evelyn Waugh, who is, one of these really gritty kind of in the trenches Catholics. And he says something I think the quote is something along the lines of, if you think I'm bad with God, can you imagine how bad I'd be without him? And I think that in those rare moments where Milo becomes subdued before, frankly, an acknowledgement that he lives a sinful lifestyle, and he says that himself, right? I mean, he says that he thinks that what he does oftentimes is not great. I think in those moments where that side of him comes out, he's way, way more profound and way more authentic than, the Cinco de Milo sort of walking around with a snake and, burly black strippers around. And but anyway, I didn't mean to kind of digress into Milo, but
I just wanted to know exactly what you were thinking there. So I appreciate it. But
yeah, so there was always the tension between like, gosh, I kind of think you're over the top in some ways, but really I respect you for speaking your mind. And as I said, it was kind of, you follow the YouTube links, one after the other, and all of a sudden this guy that was Canadian and said all the time, started showing up in my YouTube feeds. And I can't recall exactly what the first video I saw of him was. But the first time I noted down who it was that I was watching was when he was talking about, kind of the real difficulty that Canadian law firms had when he was acting as a consultant to them, of keeping their, rock star, senior partner capable women. And he kind of in that conversation, details the kinds of unique pressures that women face in the workplace when it's crossed with their, natural desires to be, wife and mother, and how that creates a tension between the two. And it's like, why would I work 80-hour work weeks for a huge paycheck when I could go have a fulfilling life as a wife and mother? And that was happening over and over again in these Canadian law firms. And hearing Jordan Peterson just describe what he experienced as a consultant to these law firms and trying to figure out strategies for both the law firms and for the women to like be fulfilled in their jobs so that they would stay around and be the incredibly competent and talented lawyers that they were. It was just mind blowing, right? It's because I'm hearing somebody speaking the language of natural law, speaking the language of gender difference, speaking the language of, attempting to solve what is a veritable gender issue, but crossed with this very, relying on scientific facts, relying on psychological studies and all these other things that it was a conundrum to me. It's like, I've never heard someone talk like this. And, I start, going through a couple of videos, and then the next real video I remember was actually one of his podcasts that was on his website. And it was a message to millennials that you can find. I think it was from January of 2017. I could be wrong on that, but I think that was when it was from. And, I heard someone speaking to my desires to change the world. And the answer was not, there's something wrong with the world out there. There's something wrong with you. Mm-hmm. And if you want to change the world, you've got to change yourself first, because how could you possibly think that you could affect something as complicated as the entire world when you can't even clean up your damn room? And that was when it clicked for me in, February of 2018, 2017, listening to this podcast. And, as I mentioned to you before, Max, it's like, I've listened to this guy now for probably 6 hours a week for the last, it's over a year now. What is that? A year and 3 months that I've been listening to him. And just everything he comes out with is just pure gold, because it's laying the responsibility for a better world back in the realm of something that you can actually do about, right? It's like, you're never going to be able to change likely you're never going to be able to change large scale institutions. You're never going to be able to remedy racial prejudice in the judicial system, for example. But do you know where you can fix racial prejudice? It's in your own actions and how you treat both yourself and people of other races. And I thought that was just, mind-bogglingly refreshing that there was somebody speaking about these issues that are clearly really important, not giving into the leftist narrative, but at the same time not being an alt-right conservative either. And that was the other thing that was interesting about him.
Yeah, I would agree that he has a lot of really, really fascinating talks, and I do like a lot of his scientific stuff. I do want to sort of try to steel man an opponent that might be listening to this before we get into too much flattery, because I agree with a lot of what you said about his ability to think and his ability to articulate a way of being in the world that is both noble and possible for everyone. But I'm wondering if you've, in this year, had any specific criticisms or specific pieces of the things he talks about that didn't synchronize with your own worldview.
I'm having trouble to kind of pull one off the top, but one of them would be, he talks a lot about a divine spark that resides within each human being. And it's that divine spark that both enables them to be a conscious actor in the world and entitles them to a certain level of dignity and respect, provided that they enact it, right? And one question that I've always kind of been not frustrated with, but curious about is, how is there a divine spark if there's no divine? And he talks about God a lot, right? And he talks about God in a very secular way, but he also talks about God in a very religious way at the same time. And yet when he's asked, are you an atheist or are you a theist? He says, I hate that question. It's none of your goddamn business. Which that's awesome, by the way. I think that's a really good answer, but it's also kind of, most people don't have trouble answering that question. And I can't help but wonder if there's, whether it's truly that he's not thought it through enough, or whether he's not paid enough, not given the question enough seriousness, to the point where he's comfortable discussing it publicly. So it could be either of those things, but I have wished for a bit more of a I think insofar as he's talking about some of the most fundamental and traditional texts of Judeo-Christianity, there's a whole lot of commentators from the time that those texts were written to now that in order to take their commentaries seriously, you also have to take into account their positions. And I think sometimes he bypasses the interpretive tradition of the fathers and of the Christian apologists of the early Christianity, and kind of ends up with, I mean, what I would say is a good thing, a re-engagement of the oldest texts, but I think it would be better if that re-engagement held in tension the interpretations of those same scriptures across time.
Mm-hmm. That is a really interesting criticism. And I haven't studied biblical commentary enough to match those together at all. But I also think, I don't know, there's the part that I started with that was very difficult to get my head around. And I think our first book, the Iliad, really helped me move into this, was his notion of archetypes, his notion of story, going back to the biblical stories. At first I thought that's all bullshit, like there are no archetypes, that's sort of abstraction. But one of the things that we brought up in our first podcast on the Iliad, or that I brought up, was just how relatable this text was. And there is something fundamental about human beings and our relationship to stories. That crossover with religion gets complicated with Peterson, but I think more than anything that speaks to the inability of anyone to put him in a box. He's very he doesn't fit a category of belief that we've described before. You can find various interpretations from The Guardian, from NBC, from Vox, that he's a alt-right neo-Nazi. He's the father figure for straight white men, a whole host of nonsense, and quite frankly, political propaganda. But no one has yet, other than clinical psychologists, defined exactly what his project is in relationship to history. And I think that sort of speaks to that criticism.
Yeah, it's unique. I mean, he's unique in that, one, he's been strawmanned and parroted by the left that he vehemently opposes so many times, and yet, unlike those that came before him, it's almost like he's not, none of the critiques have worked, right? There was the scandal with Milo, and ultimately that led to his having to resign from Breitbart, and he went and apparently started a media company. And maybe it's just because I don't follow him anymore, but it's like I haven't seen him appear in the mainstream. Mainstream's not the right word. I haven't even seen him appear in sort of this alternative media sphere, at least in my own searches. But Peterson seemingly can't be stopped by a parroting or a straw manning or a taking a phrase out of context. He is resilient. And I think that that's precisely because he's so authentic. Mm-hmm. If he had an alternative project in mind, if he really was just a closet neo-Nazi, then that stuff would have come out by now. I mean, the guy's been berated and taken through the ringer for the last 24 months, and no dirt on him has come up. And that's because he's a genuine guy who, in my opinion, really embraces what I would call the essence of the philosophical spirit. And that's the essence of the person who tries, who asks questions, who doesn't pretend to know the answers ahead of time, and so is always surprised by the answers that come about. And I think that perspective enables him to truly be, one of these non-categorizable characters, because insofar as people have ideologies, we spell out the answer to the most fundamental question and then assert that answer to the most fundamental question is the answer to every question, right? I mean, I think that's a pretty standard definition of what an ideology is, right? It's like everything is is, say, a war between the oppressor and the oppressed, and then suddenly you can go explain every phenomenon in the world by that first principle. So that would be the neo-Marxist or the Marxist first principle. And then there's, say, the Freudian first principle, that everything is a manifestation of sexual, repressed sexual energy, right? And then you can go explain everything in the world, including the great destruction of World War I, which Freud did in terms of a death instinct that was ultimately the perfection of the desire for sexual release. But Peterson doesn't seem to take that first principle first approach. Rather, he weeds around in the particulars that we have here and is building up a system in reverse from the traditionally philosophical manner of building a system, right? It's usually you have a first principle and you build out a system up from the bottom, right? But Jordan Peterson seems to, and I think that this is a testament to his pragmatism, is that he looks around in the world at the particulars, abstracts from the particulars to, to a sort of still very particular but sort of universal layer, and then abstracts from that to yet another sort of particular, sort of universal layer, and then keeps abstracting. And, probably given enough time, maybe his project is to discover that first principle last rather than first. And I think that that's a unique quality of his.
Yeah, I do want to go back real quick. You said nothing's come out about his past in the last 24 months. It's actually much worse than that. He has thousands of hours of lectures from his university class, like literally thousands of hours where he's taping the class for his students, and nothing came out of those either.
So the guy's been posting on YouTube for years.
Yeah, and you could sift through every lecture, and I don't think I've seen a single controversy from them. But I think also what's very strange about this categorization issue. I agree that he is working from the particulars, but very differently than previous, maybe archetypal or religious style thinkers. He is a scientist, and he relies heavily on science. And I have yet to find an instance where Jordan Peterson is talking about scientific data or scientific research, and somebody is criticizing his interpretation of the data or the research that he's citing and so on. So that's another fascinating aspect to the categorization issue. He begins with science in some fundamental way, and he builds the abstractions from both science, myth, and history in a very unique way. It's almost like he's both a secular humanist and a religious person.
Indeed. Well, this is one of the things that I think got me hooked on him so super early. So it's, I see these first couple videos, then I check out his website, and I'm a humanities guy, right? It's like I studied in college Latin, Greek, philosophy, and French. I don't think you get more humanities than that. And I pull up his recommended books list. My one critique of that book list was that it only featured writers from, more or less the last 2 centuries. But then I looked at the authors, and then it was, oh my gosh, every single author from the last 2 centuries that my well-grounded humanities education has taught me to be important are here on this list, right? Here's Dostoevsky, here's Nietzsche, here's Solzhenitsyn, like all of these thinkers that had, in some way, I had already encountered in my reading of the great books. I'm seeing reverberated by this, scientist. And I was struck by the true, I would say, the liberality of his thinking, right? Just the fundamental claim of the liberal arts is that the study of poetry increases one's capacity for the study of biology and vice versa. And I think that that's really kind of, I think that's a platitude often in liberal arts circles that we say that, but then it's like, I've not really met too many philosophers who, debate about material causes who know much about physics. And here's a guy who's talking about biological causes who are talking about, philosophically, what we would call material causes, and then has the biological data and evidence to back it up. And that's just, again, it's a testament to his uniqueness, and it's also a testament to the fact that I think he embodies what a genuine spirit of the liberal arts used to look like, right, back in the age of the medieval university, but since the age of specialization has really fallen out of favor.
Yeah, there's I sort of touched this at the beginning, but I've been a long time Sam Harris fan, and I'm still a big Sam Harris fan. I love a lot of his work, especially his book Lying. If anyone hasn't read it, it's a wonderful ethical analysis of lying. But in the history of Sam Harris's show, there's been a bunch of detractors that were dishonest and malicious people, and then he gets in this big fight with Jordan Peterson, and I was thinking, like, this guy is a bit off his rocker. He's talking about the Bible. He's talking about archetypes and myths. But as soon as I went into the scientific part of what he was saying, it became much more interesting. And you have another member of the, quote, intellectual dark web, Brett Weinstein, who's a evolutionary biologist from Evergreen State University. And he said that everything Jordan Peterson said about evolutionary theory goes along with everything I know about evolutionary theory. And this is someone who's studied evolutionary biology for decades. And so that's sort of the thing that's so strange about him. Like, he would be a crackpot, like, if you just listen to the archetype myth stuff. But he has this very strange way of building on the foundations of science to get to meaning and human life and human experience. But like, do you fully bat along with this archetypal view of the world that Peterson lays out?
I think I do. And well, ultimately, the reason for that comes from my own study of the ancient stories and the myths. I mean, we discussed at length, I think, in the Iliad podcast, the analogies that I saw between some of the stories of the House of Dardanos, like the Trojans, and analogies between those stories and the stories in the book of Genesis about the house of Joseph, right? So there's an obscure, I mean, it's not obscure, but there's a little scene in the Iliad where it's describing the progeny of Aeneas, and he himself is a member of the House of Dardanos. And we see a story about a guy who is super competent, super able, and is the more or less a servant to a master, and is responsible for everything that the master has and holds dear. And then the master's wife tries to seduce the steward, and he says no, and then she accuses him of raping her, and then he is dispossessed by his master and has to go out and start doing everything anew. And it's like, hold on, wait, am I reading the story of Joseph in Egypt in the book of Genesis, or am I reading the Iliad right now? This is the same story. And I think, that connection and many others, there's this archetypal theme of what it means to suffer through the world as a competent human being. It's like you're going to rise to the top of the status that you've been given if you're competent, and then every force and power that be is going to attempt to take you down from that. And the response of the truly heroic man is to just start over again, to kind of brush it off and say, wasn't my fault that I'm now in this situation. It was sort of fate, and it was the malevolence of others, but now I'm going to just rise to the top in my new sphere. So insofar as I've actually witnessed the archetypal similarities between these ancient stories that, have literally zero connection to one another in terms of the what we would call maybe like the genealogy of the myths, right? It's like there is literally zero connection between the Homeric hymns and the bards that were singing the tales of the Trojan War in Greece in the 8th century BC and the mythologists and writers in the Holy Land about 200 years earlier. So we know that from archaeological evidence. The two people didn't interact. So that means that those stories are more fundamental. They're older, right? They are so old that they're perhaps some of the oldest stories that human beings ever told, right? Those first couple of apes that climbed out of the tree and started talking to one another or something, and they told stories. And so, and that's what I think is compelling about the archetypes from an evolutionary perspective. It's like, well, there's a reason why they exist in every culture, is because these were the first abstractions that human beings ever made. And oral cultures have a very oral cultures that they remember things like we literate culture people can't possibly fathom. And so that's how you can have a story that appears at the very genesis of human being that persists to the year 2018.
Yeah, and there's the evolutionary argument here is very striking from Peterson. I think this is in book 2 of 12 Rules for Life. But it's essentially that human beings evolved as social creatures. So all of our wiring was towards a social world. And we used the social framing of what we understood from each other to describe the universe through myth and story. So like that's not a natural phenomena. Like lightning, that's Zeus's anger or wrath. And so we used sort of the narrative of existence that makes sense in a social context of a sort of pre-civilizational being to begin to abstract away from what is social to bringing what is social to nature, and then eventually constructing such perfected abstractions that we were able to derive rules and maxims about how to exist in nature from our beginning as social beings. Is a very interesting argument about moral progress and the human being's earliest attempts to abstract away from what he understood about his context.
And I think, that's precisely what the archetypes are. And I think there's sort of this characterization of the archetypes, and I don't know quite where this comes from. I haven't really studied archetypes in an academic setting at all, but there is just this notion that Jung was one of these guys who was off his rocker, one of the earliest psychologists, and despite his incredible contributions to the field, he was just wrong about certain things because they weren't empirically verifiable. And it's like, well, that's actually up for debate. It's like, what do you define by empirically verifiable? It's like, to me, empirically verifiable is I look at 10 different cultures, 10,000 years ago that are radically separated by space, that couldn't possibly have interacted with one another, and they're telling stories that are almost identical. That's pretty empirical for me. And so what I don't understand is perhaps, and I think this is part of why Jordan Peterson is able to maintain the sort of interest that he does by talking about these things, is that he shows, perhaps for the first time in a public forum, that, hey, these archetypes are empirically verifiable. And yeah, we haven't quite yet defined or laid out an experiment today that would be able to demonstrate their presence within the mind of an individual, because if you were to attempt to do that, you'd have to desocialize them from their socialized context, and that's not really possible. So like doing an actual experiment on individuals today is difficult, but then you look at the evidence that's less difficult to obtain, and you see very clearly where the archetypes arise, and even a potential explanation for how.
Yeah, I'm actually reminded here of studies, for instance, on human beings are most species are not monogamous, but human beings are generally monogamous across cultures, and that's what's recommended in religious texts. And then when we go into the contemporary data, we see that monogamous relationships have, or people who believe that monogamy is a biological concept and then live by it, they have better sex lives, they're happier, et cetera, et cetera. And yet in the Old Testament, if someone commits adultery, stone them. There's a way that human beings were able to abstract into a religious worldview things that have been shown to be biologically useful for survival and well-being. So there is,
I think it's deeper than just survival, right? And I think that this is what Nietzsche's contribution to Jordan Peterson's thinking is. It's living is not surviving. Living is thriving, right? That's from the late notebooks of Nietzsche. That it's the evolutionary argument is wrong when it talks about the fundamental drive within the individual organism is to simply live. It's actually not survival, but thrival, if you could pen a word that influences evolution more than anything else.
Yeah. And then I don't know if you heard at the end of that sentence, there was "and well-being," which I guess you could loosely construe as thriving. But I mean, it's a very strange time in our scientific worldview, because after Freud and Jung, we had things like the behaviorist movement and other reductive attempts to explain things away. And I think what Jordan Peterson really does well with the connection between myth, story, meaning, and evolutionary science is he's attempting to bridge the gap between our scientific understanding of nature and our understanding of ourselves as beings who are living a story, which we would call our life.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be, whatever is true about literature or whatever is true about our story of ourselves that we tell ourselves, or the facts about our life, has to be true about physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. And I feel like really one of the more profound aspects of his project is to bridge the gap between meaning and empirically derived facts in such a way where the scientific, more reductive methods don't detract at all from what we are as human beings, but they actually work with some of our more poetic or spiritual aspects.
I think this is actually a great segue to talk about your first encounter with Jordan Peterson on the Waking Up podcast, because this is exactly the debate that Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson had, right? What is, if anything, the connection between scientific fact, truth, and meaning, right? And perhaps you can summarize it better than I can, but I would say the overall, the dramatis persona of that debate was something like Jordan Peterson, who says that scientific truth is subsidiary to what we would call moral or pragmatic truth. And Sam Harris, who would say that no, moral or pragmatic truth is subsidiary to a scientific truth. And that was fundamentally the debate, right?
Yeah, that it was essentially the debate. And I honestly can't make heads or tails of it at this point.
Well, even with that, tell me about your gut reaction to that podcast.
Initially, it was, Sam Harris destroyed this guy. And he's just, pulling patterns out of ancient texts and extrapolating beyond data in a way that's, intellectually dishonest. And once I heard Peterson talk to Brett Weinstein on the Joe Rogan podcast and had listened to Brett Weinstein's own evolutionary sort of lectures, or I guess they're more like interviews on his channel, The Evolutionist, which I highly recommend. And I realized that there has to be a connection between culture or meme or religious understanding or the stories a culture tells and the values that it has and the human ability to survive or thrive initially. For instance, we know that the human population at one point fell below 20,000. At least this was the last theory I heard before human beings left North Africa. And so there's something about I mean, we're not fast compared to other animals. We're not strong compared to other animals. And there needs to be something to explain this complex social world that includes things like religion and story and myth and tradition. And that has to match with our understanding of how human beings survived evolutionarily. So I still can't make heads or tails of the epistemological debate, but what Sam Harris has to account for is what you were saying, the universals across cultures, the stories across cultures, the similarities between certain religious traditions, and the evolutionary, well, just the fact of our existence that our species survived. There has to be something functional about our storytelling capacity. And therefore, there has to be something true in these stories that is fundamental to human beings collectively. So
yeah, this is precisely the point that Sam Harris or that Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro kind of hit home in their most recent podcast together. I think it was published last week or this past week, on the fact that consciousness is something that arrives out of evolution and then ultimately turns back around and begins to alter evolution's course. And it does so primarily through the sexual selection of human females versus chimpanzees, 100,000 or 300,000 years ago, however long it was. I'm not an expert on the dates, but it was precisely a conscious choice to mate with the most competent male and outsourcing the question of competence to the males themselves, who determined their hierarchy, that influenced the sexual and natural selection there forward, right? So that's what's just remarkable about human being, is that we are a product of natural evolution and then a source of that continued path of evolution, right? Because we can consciously choose those traits or characteristics that we wish to propagate further into our own progeny. And this is, I think, ultimately where Sam Harris would have to lose the debate in some sense, because I would, were Sam Harris sitting across from me in a room and we're talking to me about, when do you cash in the truth of a certain statement, right? That was kind of a trope that he was using in the Jordan Peterson podcast, pretty frequently. Like, when do you get to cash in the truth of certain, nuclear science that would ultimately lead to the destruction of the human race? And he's trying to ask a human question outside the context of human existence, which is to say, he's putting a subject where there is no subject and there's only object. And I think ultimately where Jordan Peterson's right is that truth does not reside in the object. Truth resides in the subject's, not only experience of the object, but also the fact that the object is given to that subject gives us a certain framework for how we have to understand the rules of the game of that object, right? Which is to say that the truth about that object cannot be divorced from the subject to whom that object is given.
Yeah, I think this is the part where I start to disagree with Peterson. But tell me what you think about this counterfactual real quick. If there was, let's say we in 2 decades, we create another intelligent species by accident. So we're experimenting on dolphins and suddenly they're talking and have culture and have civilization. Or there's some other intelligent form of being in the universe. The truth of that object, whatever it is, wouldn't be subject to humans or that thing. the truth of that object would be contained in its physics, wouldn't it? I mean, regardless of what intelligent or otherwise sentient being you're looking at, the object exists whether or not that being would exist.
Well, see, but that's just like asking how can. Well, it's similar to asking the question how two different humans arrive at the same sort of quote objective truths observing the same object as each other do, right? Insofar as there's a shared experience of an object that can be articulated in speech and shared and debated upon, we're already back in the subjective realm. And so I would argue that whether it's a human or a super intelligent dolphin or maybe an alien species,
Sorry about that.
whatever it is, the fact of the matter is that we share, we both participate in a collective subjectivity insofar as we can articulate speech to one another. So I don't know that it necessarily provides an adequate impasse to what Jordan Peterson is bringing up in that podcast, right? Ultimately, so maybe here's the idea, right? That the lowly humans on Earth develop the hydrogen bomb and then use it to eradicate themselves from the Earth, and the alien species come along and they do their scientific study and they learn about what the humans were actually fighting about, and they learn about capitalism and communism and all of that stuff. They come to participate in that debate that led to the eradication of the humans, right? They have to fundamentally take a side. And maybe that side is that these beliefs weren't worth eradicating each other over. Or maybe that side is, wow, one of these sides was actually wrong. And it resulted in the death of this entire species that was intelligent. We should learn from them, and we should completely reject the philosophy that led to the eradication of the human species, namely communism, right? So the thought is then, even if the humans are eradicated, there's still a subjective community that's created between whatever alien species observes the phenomenon post hoc and the phenomenon itself, which is to kind of reverberate my initial point that it's insofar as human subjectivity is what it is, there's no way there's only one kind of consciousness, right? And that's the experience of a given object.
That's what I think. I don't know if we're talking past each other, and I have an inkling that Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson might have been. I think there's two levels we're talking at, and one is the level of subjectivity, and then the other is on the level of epistemology, which is what is true about reality, or is there a reality exterior to the human? And I think, I want to go back into your point because I don't feel like I fully grasped it, but maybe this might help. What Sam Harris is saying is that there is a reality whether or not we choose to admit it. And I think what Jordan Peterson is saying, that it is only in our admission of a reality as conscious beings that that reality exists. Does any of that vibe with your point, or do you want to re-articulate?
The fundamental question is, and I think that this is actually the fundamental question of 20th century philosophy and forward, maybe even just post-Kantian philosophy. Is there a world without the human, without the human being who experiences it? And because ultimately, like, the Kantian point is interesting, right? It's, we can posit that there is a there is, but we can't do anything else besides that. That's not mere speculation, right? everything that we attempt to describe about the objective minus ourselves is just the fact that the object exists. But then any quality, any mode, any property is a result of our subjective experience of it. And then like that has just a devastating effect on, you know, the history of philosophy thereafter. It's like, well, that's actually a really good point. How can I describe this glass to you as an object apart from my subjective experience of the object? Right. And this ultimately leads to the postmodernist claim that there's an infinite interpretation. There are infinite interpretations of the world in which we live. Mm-hmm. And therefore, they claim all of those interpretations are equally viable. And it's, well, you know, Jordan Peterson takes the first premise without taking the second. It's like, actually, no, there are certain interpretations that are more viable than others. And that's evidenced, you know, firstly by, do the other human beings want to play with me? Am I suffering? Am I in pain? These other sorts of things that help us to indicate which of these interpretations are in fact true. So, you know, to circle back to the question, I think that, you know, fundamentally, were Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson talking past each other? Yeah, but it's only because Jordan Peterson actually engages the question of consciousness in a way that I'm not sure that Sam Harris did.
That's really interesting because Jordan Peterson said that on the Rubin Report. Sam Harris simply doesn't understand consciousness. And then Sam Harris actually emailed Jordan Peterson and was like, you've got me wrong on consciousness. And Sam Harris wrote this book called Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion. And that book contains several long sections on his understanding of the irreducibility of consciousness, or what's called in analytic philosophy, the hard problem of consciousness. So I do think Harris is taking consciousness very seriously. I really don't know where that, I mean, it's basically a fundamentally different conception of what human beings are in relationship to the physical world. But strangely enough, their ethics don't diverge very much. So that's even stranger from this. Like, they fundamentally disagree on epistemology and the nature of reality in relationship to subjectivity, or at least they seem to. All the while, the ethics that they come up with, their most important sort of principles, is the truth, or telling the truth,
right?
Align. So it's one of those philosophical arguments that I think neither side can marshal sufficient evidence for to make a knockdown case against the other. And I mean, that was the most abstract we've ever been on the podcast, just trying to get through.
Well, I mean, the problem of epistemology is interesting, right? Because we live in an age where the academy, or just the philosophical tradition that we've been handed, is in an episteme first kind of mindset, right? And that's precisely because, you know, those who came before Kant and the post-Kantians and all these other things, they were able to take for granted certain suppositions that today we would take on faith, right? I'm talking about the Empire State Building right now, and the Empire State Building is, and you know, kind of pre-Kant, you might be able to get away with that, but after the articulation of the transcendental subject that Kant gives us, it's, well, you're not talking about the Empire State Building. You're talking about your experience of the Empire State Building, and I'm not going to give you the same amount of stick that I gave you beforehand. You know, before we were all Kantians. So the fact that they have radically different epistemologies and yet end up with the same ethics is, I think, a testimony to the fact that epistemology comes second anyway, right? And that what's first for humans is ethics, because any attempt to speak, act, or do anything whatsoever is the positing of a structure of value. I said this and not that, therefore this is better than that, right? So we start with ethics. Philosophy, on the other hand, as we were talking about earlier with the whole first principles thing, attempts to build out a system from the most abstract or the most primary thing or the most natural thing and get to the level where the human is now and start talking about things like ethics. So ethics is last for philosophy, but first for humans. And sort of, I guess, the not indirect proof, but the interesting assertion that you could make there is that, insofar as the humans, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, have the same ethics, they actually have the same first principle too. It's just that one of them, or it's just that they're either not sure about what that first principle is, they're ignorant of what it is, or they're dishonest about what it is, right? And I'm not claiming that either of them is being dishonest, but it's simply the fact that we can posit an ethical system and be right and be wrong about the philosophy that leads up to it.
Yeah.
Precisely because of how the human being exists in relation to philosophy.
I agree with that interpretation. I was reminded of me and my roommate for 4 years, Armand, who I promise will eventually be on the Specialists podcast. We used to get into hour-long arguments, and 9 times out of 10 we realized that we weren't saying a different thing, we were emphasizing a different point. And I think Eric Weinstein, he is my favorite thinker that I've listened to, he said that Sam Harris is obsessed with truth. That's the way he goes about the intellectual conversation. And Jordan Peterson is obsessed with meaning. And that's the way that he goes about the conversation. But at the end of the day, I think that those two conceptions have to be compatible if they're both viable. If we can have a conversation about meaning, to use your phrase, if we can have a conversation about ethics, then that conversation has to relate to reality as we can best understand it at any given time. So there's this fundamentally different emphasis between the two. But I don't know if we can make claims about reality per se that would bridge either emphasis or bridge that difference in emphasis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. But it ultimately leaves us still with the question: how do we resolve that debate? Or do we simply say that the debate doesn't actually matter when it comes to human beings making decisions?
Yeah, I would say that it's one of those questions that is, this is the beautiful thing about studying philosophy and or first principles, is there are questions that the following generation, hopefully, if we keep the project of civilization going, there's questions that they will confront with more wisdom and truth and knowledge at hand than we have. And I think that this debate really rests at the very horizon line of what we understand to be true about human beings and our relationship to a reality, whatever the word reality might mean in that sense. And so I don't think that it is, given current human knowledge, resolvable yet. But I think that it's very useful for trying to figure out the relationship between subjective and experience, meaning and ethics, our lives and how we behave in our lives, and what we think is true about existence or our universe. And I think that the epistemological beginning with Sam Harris or the pragmatic / ethical view of Jordan Peterson is, it's a different way of articulating a relationship to reality. And I don't know I don't know what fact of the matter or what proposition we could bring up to verify the difference philosophically.
I mean, Peterson would say that you could simply look at history.
Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can look at history insofar as well, it would seem that the atheistic principle that kind of Sam Harris and the whole new atheist movement sort of embody has only been mainstream, truly mainstream, in one other regime that's ever really existed, and that's communism, right? I mean, obviously, it's a very different form of atheism, and I'll grant that. But the fact of the matter is that when we are confronted with the dynamic change from nihilism to totalitarianism, that only happens in an atheistic world, right? Because a divine principle, God, whatever you want to call it, gives you a grounding that both prevents you from being a nihilist, but also prevents you from totalitarianism, because of, particularly in the Judeo-Christian understanding of that divine principle, it imbues every individual with, divine natural rights and responsibilities that have to be respected. And that's the source of the ethics. And that's why you treat people the way that you do. Maybe he wouldn't articulate it in the way that I just formulated it, but I do think that Peterson, at least from a historical point of view, has a contention that Sam Harris can't muster, and that's you mess with things like religion and spirituality at your own peril, right? And frankly, I think Peterson would say, no, you're just wrong, and Nietzsche was right. It's like when you take God out from Western culture, you don't get to keep the ethics that God gave them, without things very quickly spiraling into hell. And and that's the interesting thought, right? It's when we engage, kind of Marxism kind of at its face value, listening to what it says, it's like we can actually empathize deeply with the ideas that are there presented, and then they manifest themselves in the world, and you have this utter catastrophe and destruction on a global scale. You might question whether or not, and I don't necessarily know what Sam Harris's politics would look like, kind of predicated upon his ethics, but you almost want to question whether the same thing would happen, and whether or not the conservative tendency that Jordan Peterson has to look at the thing that you don't understand that exists and has existed for a while and assert, I don't know what this is here for, but it was probably built for a good reason, so I'm going to leave it there unless I have a compelling reason to tear it down.
I feel like you more or less recapitulated the conversation that we had when you were interviewing me about my intellectual development. I guess the way we have a different historical interpretation of atheism, maybe, that makes me hate the word, as we talked about, because it's a non-category.
Yeah.
But you can still, we had Jefferson and the Jefferson Bible and a sort of Enlightenment deism. And I see the new atheist movement as the next logical step from the small L liberal constitutional, democratic systems. Their atheism is derived from the Enlightenment school of thinkers, who would have considered themselves deist at the time. And I think that a word like atheist is it's like oh, who is she? And I'm like, oh, she's a non-philosophy reader, or she's a non-golfer. So what is she? We have no idea. And I
Right.
think you can still arrive at a realist conception of truth and a realist conception of ethics without the assumption of a supernatural. Um, I think that there are certainly still strong forms of atheism that could lead to the regimes that you were mentioning in the 20th century, but I don't think that the atheism that's represented in the New Atheists captures that in any way. They are secular liberals, essentially, or another phrase would be secular humanists. And I mean, we talked about this earlier, and I think here's where I'm going to disagree with you. The like, for instance, the some of the rules in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, we can draw a direct connection between them and a scientific fact. Like the germ theory of disease wasn't known, but God says, like, don't desecrate camp by going to the bathroom in it. So, like, that has a specific survival value, whether or not we're religious. And I think what the new atheists are, they're batting along with Christians and other forms of religious people and saying that we can understand the world and it's intelligible. So they're not going into nihilism or social constructionism. And then we have a different camp of atheists that are saying the truth is entirely relative to human experience and human whim and human subjectivity. Does that make sense as a distinction?
No, it definitely does. And I think I probably should have been more charitable to the fact that atheism is a non-category and it's difficult to predicate qualities or properties to the group that has nothing in common with one another, except for the fact they don't believe in God.
I mean, you could hypothetically be an atheist and still believe in supernatural entities, right? Because like a theism is a system of belief. And I don't know. I think that the debate gets incredibly clouded when we treat atheism as a category. Um, and in that circumstance, we have to return to the particular beliefs of a specific person who says he's an atheist, rather than categorizing them together. Because the label used to make sense when religion was more prolific in society, had more of a grip on society. But the more and more that society has become secular, the more the label tells you absolutely nothing about a particular person's beliefs about ethics and the best way to organize a society.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I think this actually might be a good opportunity to maybe pivot a little bit in the concluding minutes of the podcast and just discuss a little bit. I mean, it is a giant leap. I'll grant it, but maybe we could just discuss a little bit to bring things back to the more concrete. How particularly Jordan Peterson, in and amongst the intellectual dark web, has had an effect upon not only our spirituality but also things like our daily habits and ethics and etc.
Yeah, I do also want to throw in politics before we end. If we could touch on the political realm in Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's start there. I mean, because I think that it's kind of a difficult topic to broach because you have the leftist narrative of him that he's this alt-right thinker, and it's like I literally was at a Jordan Peterson talk 2 weeks ago, and Dave Rubin opened the show, and part of the opening act was him pulling out his iPhone and doing a video for all those NBC commentators who just wrote those hit pieces on Peterson, and he literally asked the crowd to jump up and scream when he identified their political affiliation, and he's like alt-right, and it's like there was one dude. and then it was, I think he said it was far right and far out, and then everybody goes wild. It's like, no, nobody here is far right, and the fact that Peterson is associated with the alt right is merely a fact that, the only way for a group or a school of thought that doesn't actually respect intellectual debate and premises and conclusions and things like this is to strawman them and to predicate them with labels. And I think that ultimately, the politics that Jordan Peterson espouses is not only classically liberal in that the individual is free and sovereign and good and has rights and privileges and all of these things. I think fundamentally, Jordan Peterson sort of represents that odd connection of what we might call social liberalism or social conservatism and economic liberalism or something like that, brought together in one package, right? So, I mean, it's like we don't really see that. It's like you've got libertarians who are economically conservative and socially liberal, and you've got conservative or like Republicans or say who are both economically and socially conservative, Democrats who are both economically and socially liberal, and then it's the fourth camp is where Jordan Peterson falls. And that's one that, at least in modern, and by modern I mean contemporary America, has really ever been mainstream or ever been tried. So it'll be interesting to see what effect he has upon the political sphere in that way. I mean, who knows? Maybe a party could, crop up, at least a viable party could crop up that was socially liberal and, socially conservative and economically liberal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, has Jordan Peterson ever really articulated a politics?
No, well, that's the interesting thing is he claims to not be a political thinker, and he talks about how, I've thought a number of times about entering politics, but every time I've decided that I need to be at the level of the individual, not at the level of the state. Then that makes him a psychologist, not a politician. But so I mean that in and of itself kind of makes him a conundrum. It's like in the day and age when political identity is seemingly paramount, here's this guy who's claiming to not have a political identity.
Yeah, and it's very strange how he got thrown into politics in and of itself through Bill C-16 in Canada.
Yeah.
But I think the most fascinating part of this is you can read 12 Rules for Life and you can listen to Jordan Peterson's lectures. You can do the self-authoring program. You can take his entire body of work on how to live the good life. And you cannot find an example of something that he says that's like wouldn't apply across races, contexts, sexuality, and so on. I mean, this claim that he's a father figure for straight white men it shows that the left is obsessed with identity. And I don't know, I was blown away before we started. I told you this, that I was reading articles on Jordan Peterson from Vox and The Guardian and NBC. And they are the most ridiculously misrepresenting political propaganda hit pieces that I've ever read in my life. And I don't know exactly what to make of him in the political sphere, but really he's just we talked about him as a philosopher, but really in books like 12 Rules for Life, he's just a psychologist. And how that's become so politicized is almost a mystery. I mean, when Bill C-16 started, people said that he was transphobic and he would discriminate against trans students in his classroom by not using their pronouns. And he said, no, if I was with a trans person, I would use their pronouns. I was saying that the law shouldn't enforce this.
Yeah.
So sort of like making Jordan Peterson a political figure is a very strange thing to do in some ways.
Well, I mean, I think the left is doing what they have to do, and that's to put people in groups so that they can play their power games. And the fact of the matter is, if they play that game long enough, they're going to lose against the side that says that they refuse to lose, right? And that's ultimately what the alt-right kind of neo-Nazi position is. It's like, you want to play group identity, that's fine. We're not going to lose. And so that means genocide. And that's really dangerous, and we want to avoid that.
Did you see the Kathy Newman interview?
Oh, yeah. I listened to it probably 4 or 5 times.
It's the most depressing hour of television I've ever watched.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just a testament to the fact that there's a whole swath of the population that's willing to dispense with what a person actually says in order to arrive at a straw man of a person that you want them to be. Right? You want the person who says that, yeah, you have to be disciplined and get up at the same time every day and, you know, eat your damn breakfast even if you don't enjoy it, and clean up your damn room and all these other things. Yeah, they want to make him into this kind of oppressive, evil, you know, father figure of straight white males, so that they don't have to take him seriously. Because I think, you know, implicitly they know that if they were to take him seriously, they would find themselves in a completely different, you know, ethical, political situation that was actually demanding the best of them and not requiring them to take the easy road.
Yeah, it's further even. I mean, it's really strange too, because it's as if everything is fundamentally reducible to what we are now in politics. Like, we are your race, you are your gender, you are your sexual orientation, and like how that identify or how that captures our politics is very strange, because there was never a time in our life, or maybe even in the history of US politics, although, I mean, there was the suffrage movement and certain other social movements about race and gender. But at least in our lifetime, and maybe even in the last maybe 30 or 40 years, there's never been a politics about or predicated on what we are. It was a politics predicated on what we believe. And I don't know, I find that the strangest thing about Jordan Peterson's detractors, that he is like the fatherhead for straight white men. And it's like, straight white men are not a group of people. I've met hundreds of them who I hate and disagree with.
Hopefully I'm not one of those people.
No.
Maybe disagree with, but not hate.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this is the beautiful thing too. Just finally on the political point, we can move to your point. The beautiful thing is that Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, that debate that we delved into, and Sam Harris and Ben Shapiro are allies now. And yet they disagree on absolutely everything.
Exactly. Right. And that's, you know, frankly, that's what real diversity is, right? It's despite your upbringing, despite your color, despite your gender, despite anything, the fact of the matter is we have a disagreement on essential topics. You believe reality to be one way, and I believe reality to be another way, and we have a language in which we can debate those facts or truths or whatever. That's what diversity looks like. And ultimately, it's in those novel attempts to articulate truth in the face of new objections that innovation occurs, right? I mean, there's this great, I believe it's from On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, where he talks about the fact that there are certain things that each generation must figure out for themselves in order that truth may not become stale. The idea being that when something gets to the point where it's passed down as dogma and no longer questioned, well, then it's been exhausted, and which is to say that what it was initially has lost its savor, and so every new generation must take up the banner of asking these deep questions for them and answering them for themselves in a particular context. And I think that's I think that concept of revivifying the truth in every new generation can only be taken seriously when it's actually about the questions and the answers and not about who is positing those questions.
Yeah, I do want to just ask quickly, and this is an extremely maybe controversial position, but it's one I've been finding more and more. Given what you said on the personal level, my two best friends in college, one was from India and the other was originally from Palestine, but came to our university from Saudi Arabia. It's as if like when they couldn't give me advice because we had different backgrounds and races and grew up in different religious contexts. I mean, one grew up as a Hindu and one grew up as a Muslim, and I grew up as a Catholic. And it's like, it's as if the advice we gave each other, the humor we shared with each other, etc., it couldn't possibly be real because of those facts. Like, isn't that the most bigoted proposition possible?
Indeed.
That it is our race or family background or country of origin that defines our relationship to each other.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think this goes to the claim that Jordan Peterson is speaking to white males or whatever it is. But it's as if this identity politics is a form of racism. And I think that's the controversial proposition that I'm entertaining. Like, it's actually racist to say that different rules apply to different groups of people, or different like what's good for me is not good for a brown-skinned person. Like, that's the definition of racism.
Well, Max, don't you know that because of, only the minority class can experience racism, because the majority class is in an experience of privilege. And so as a result, any attempt to denigrate their power position is actually just an affirmation of justice rather than racism.
But I mean, the irony is that both of these brown-skinned people were a lot smarter than I'll ever be.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, the irony of the leftist position and their gerrymandering of the terms it's deeply problematic, right? I mean, I literally had a professor at Xavier state that a woman could not be sexist because she was in a like a reduced power privilege, and that because men have privilege, any attempt to assert dominance over that privilege couldn't be regarded as sexism, because sexism is by definition an act of oppressor against oppressed. And I didn't know what to respond to that, so I just kind of walked away. It's like, well, okay, I don't want to participate in this conversation anymore because clearly you're not listening to yourself.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is the definition of sexism. Women are so oppressed and febrile and pathetic that we need to elevate them. It's like, no, there are tons of women who are as smart as tons of men, and we relate to each other in a world. And like, the very definition of being a sexist is to say that women are weak and oppressed and incapable of taking control of their lives and need the status of not being able to say anything sexist. That is an intrinsically sexist idea.
Indeed.
And I don't know, just to wrap up this point, I have not yet found an ethical proposition from Jordan Peterson about how to live the good life that could not apply to every race and gender and sexual orientation. Like he can't possibly be for an identity group. And this straw manning of him is one of the most malicious and dishonest things I've ever observed in my intellectual life. And the fact that it's coming from mainstream news organizations shows how far we've slid.
Yeah,
you can disagree with
despicable.
Yeah, you can disagree with Jordan Peterson about, like Sam Harris does about anything, but to call him a bigot is it's the most malicious kind of character assassination and political propaganda that I don't know. I think that I've witnessed in my lifetime. I apologize. I needed to go off on a tangent. There was something pent up there.
Oh, so I mean, let's pivot here. I mean, I think that this is actually quite fitting, right? We usually close out our podcasts with a moral lesson, and I think that a good way of capping this podcast would be, what's the moral lesson that you've received from Jordan Peterson? And feel free to take a longer allotment of time than we normally take for that, because I think it's a deep question.
Yeah, there's hundreds. I think that the most straightforward one is the way in which Jordan Peterson talks about the adding up of time. So if you spend, like an hour on social media every day, that is 365 hours a year, and that comes out to, maybe 20 something days. And he has this way of articulating forming good habits in your life that's about, if I do this thing for X amount of time every day, even if it's 30 minutes, you're going to end up with 10 days of practice in that positive habit. And I thought that was a really good way to frame how to improve your life in a day-to-day fashion. It's quite simple. You just go, okay, what am I spending my time on every day? And then what could I spend my time on that would improve my life or circumstances for 30 minutes every day? And at the end of that period, you will have practiced that thing for 10 days. And I really like that way of framing changes in behavior through time. Because when we watch one Netflix show, we're like, I'm not wasting time right now. I'm just relaxing. But if you watch one Netflix show every day, you end up wasting 25 days a year or something.
Yeah. I think my own moral lesson from Jordan Peterson, while I, definitely think that what you've said is equally relevant to what I've learned from him, I think most deeply, my moral lesson, my takeaway from everything that I've heard from him over the course of the last, 15 months has been, every evil in the world is the result of human actions and human decisions. And you don't find yourself in a state like communist Russia or Nazi Germany innocently, right? You contributed to the rise of the predicament in which you now exist. And, I can't help but take that same kind of framework and apply it to myself. It's like, well, here I find myself in the context of a mainstream media culture and political culture that's full of division and tribalism and all of these things. And I can't help but wonder, well, where's my little lie that has contributed to that? In what way am I responsible for the polarization that we now experience in our political sphere? And what now having realized that I'm guilty before we are in hell in a handbasket, what can I do to stop it? What can I do to unmake, untell the lies that I've told and undo the moral wrongs that I've committed that landed us in this kind of situation? And then I think deeper than that, it's more generally that I am capable of the most evil acts that any human has ever perpetrated. The fact of the matter is that I would have found myself in the Wehrmacht in Nazi Germany, or I would have found myself as an SS informant, or I would have found myself as, in some other way contributing to the great evils of the Nazi Empire. And when you take that fact seriously as a fact, that you would not have been the guy rescuing the Jews, you would have been the guy shooting them naked in a field. You suddenly are forced to embrace that you need to get your shit together, or you can pretend to be ignorant, and then catastrophe is going to break loose, and it's going to be all your fault, and you're going to know it, and you're going to ignore it. And the fact of the matter is that I don't want to be the kind of person that contributes to those kinds of horrors. I want to be the kind of person that prevents them. And so the way to do that is not to protest. The way to do that is not even to be, activistic in the casting of one's votes. The way to do that is to get yourself in order. This is kind of tangential, but very much related. So I'm a Catholic, and I take very seriously the church's teachings on abortion. And one of the things that this has taught me, that Jordan Peterson has taught me specifically in relation to this debate, is that, if I truly believe that abortion is wrong, and I think that it ought to never occur, then what I need to do is not go protest the Supreme Court or stand outside of an abortion clinic. What I need to do is to ensure that every action that I ever commit in my lifestyle never contributes to complicity with one. Right? So what does that entail? That means that I'm never going to have an affair wherein my mistress might get pregnant and need to get an abortion so as to protect my reputation. It also means that I need to treat my daughters with dignity and respect and love them such that if they ever came to me saying that they were pregnant because they had sex with their high school boyfriend, that I wasn't going to fly into a rage, that they would, perceive beforehand and thus get the abortion to prevent it from happening, right? If I want to actually contribute to the eradication of what I believe to be evil, it entails me never, ever being complicit in any way to one of them. And that's, I think, a good summary of what I've learned from Jordan Peterson.
I really liked a lot of that. I was curious when you were talking about contributing to the rise of more destructive ideas, if you had anything specific in mind in your life. A way in which you might have contributed to those ideas.
Well, I mean, I know as a high school student, I was particularly boisterous on the conservative side of things. Tribal. I mean, like you would expect any high schooler to be. And I'm sure that my rambunctiousness and my dogmatic assertion of conservative principles at least catalyzed more than one person on the opposite side of the sphere, right? And then, who knows, perhaps that person who was catalyzed by my dogmatic rightism became a dogmatic leftist who solidified the existence of another dogmatic conservative. And ultimately, I mean, it's a process there that leads to the polarization, and I'm responsible for that. I can look back at conversations that I had and debates that I took part in, that I did not contribute to the authentic exploration of ideas. In fact, I I probably, in an attempt to just be right, forced another person into a dogmatic position that I would really not have wished them to be in.
Yeah, I can remember similar regrets on my behalf, at least with political ideology. I mean, it's sort of the beautiful thing about Jordan Peterson is the notion that we're all responsible for this, whatever this is. We're all responsible for this world, this life, and like the central message there is in being responsible for this, whether it's politics or whether it's our community, we must first be responsible for ourselves. It goes back to our discussion in the Nicomachean Ethics about the relationship between the polis and the individual, and how you can't really separate politics per se or the responsibility to a social world from individual considerations of ethics. And I think he captures that connection brilliantly. Like, you want to go change the world, start with changing yourself. And, I think that responsibility really does scale. I mean, none of us live in a closed system. And if we took that responsibility seriously, which is, I think, the heart of Peterson's message, we would make many changes that would lead to a better world by first taking responsibility for ourselves and our situation.
You know, Max, I think that's a great way to end this episode of Cryptosophy.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I wish we could have delved into even more Jordan Peterson. He's a fascinating character, and maybe we can return after the next Jordan Peterson Sam Harris conversation in, I think, London this summer. So I'd love to return to the topic.
I think they've got 3 scheduled on the calendar, so that should be plenty of fodder for further conversations. And who knows, maybe we'll see a little bit of a resolution to the debate that they had on those epistemological issues.
Yeah, or at the very least, I hope we see a disagreement that is clearer.
All right. Hey, thanks to everyone who participated in this podcast. It's been a great pleasure for Max and I to discuss Jordan Peterson and the great impact that he's had on both of our lives. And we look forward to our next podcast, which will probably be next week on Aristotle's metaphysics. And we thank you once again for joining us on Cryptosophy.